Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going right into the heart of a really dark chapter in American history.
Yeah.
The Houston mass murders.
Yeah, a chilling case.
It is. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll, he was known as the Candyman, terrorized Houston, Texas.
Right.
And he's believed to have murdered at least 28 young men and boys.
At least.
At least 28, yeah, it could be more. We've got a ton of sources here. We got news articles, forensic reports, even just Corll's Wikipedia entry to kind of break this all down.
Absolutely. It's a case that even decades later continues to just fascinate and horrify. And we're going to try to piece together what we know about Corll, his crimes, and those lives that were just tragically cut short.
Yeah, and what really gets me is how utterly normal Corll seemed on the surface.
Right.
You know, he had that nickname, the Candyman, because he worked at a candy factory.
Mm-hmm.
And even gave out sweets to neighborhood kids.
What's they have candy to kids?
Yeah. It's chilling to think that this seemingly ordinary guy was harboring such darkness.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how appearances can be deceiving. I mean, we're talking about a guy who served in the Army, had a seemingly regular childhood, blended into the community. There wasn't anything outwardly alarming about him. Yet underneath it all, he was meticulously planning and executing these horrific acts.
Right. So let's rewind. Dean Arnold Corll, born in Indiana in 1939.
Okay.
Seemingly average childhood, even described as quiet and shy by some. He moves to Houston, works as an electrician, lives a pretty unassuming life. When does this twisted other side start to emerge?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. There's some speculation that his realization of being homosexual during his time in the Army in a much less accepting era might have played a role. We can't know for sure, but imagine that internal struggle. The fear of judgment, the pressure of living a double life.
Right. And it's hard not to wonder how much societal attitudes at the time might have contributed to that internal pressure cooker.
Absolutely.
But of course, that in no way excuses his actions.
Exactly. It's crucial to acknowledge that societal context without diminishing the severity of his crimes. It's a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Right. Now, Corll didn't act alone in this horror. He had two teenagers. David Brooks and Emerwayne Henley become his accomplices.
Yeah.
And it's almost more disturbing that these weren't hardened criminals. These were kids themselves, seemingly drawn into Corll's web.
Right, and that's where the psychological complexity of this case truly comes into play. You know, we're not just dealing with the perpetrator and his victims. These accomplices were both victims themselves subjected to Corll's manipulation and abuse.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think that Brooks, at just 12 years old when he met Corll, actually viewed him as a father figure.
It's wild.
It makes you question how someone could develop that kind of twisted attachment to their abuser.
It speaks to the insidious nature of grooming and coercive control.
Yeah.
You know, Corll knew how to exploit vulnerabilities, how to create a sense of dependency and loyalty, even as he was drawing them into this world of unimaginable horror.
And the fact that it was Henley who ultimately killed Corll, ending the spree, it adds another layer to this whole twisted dynamic.
It really blurs the lines. On one hand, Henley was a victim of Corll's abuse. On the other hand, he was actively involved in the suffering of others. It raises these uncomfortable questions about culpability, survival, and the complexities of justice.
So we have Corll, this seemingly average guy with this dark hidden life, and his teenage accomplices caught in this horrific web. What can you tell us about the victims?
Well, the victims were primarily young men and boys, many from disadvantaged backgrounds. Corll often targeted runaways or those he felt were less likely to be missed.
Yeah, that detail right there is just heartbreaking. He preyed on the vulnerable, those who might have slipped through the cracks of society.
Yeah, it's a tragic pattern we see in many serial killer cases. The choice of victims often reflects that desire for control, that need to exert power over those perceived as weak or disposable.
Let's talk about those horrifying discoveries.
Yeah.
Those first bodies found in a boat shed that Corll had rented. It must have been a scene straight out of a nightmare.
The boat shed became this gruesome epicenter of the investigation. You know, the bodies were wrapped in plastic, some shot, some strangled, the air thick with the stench of lime used to mask the decay. It was a scene that deeply affected even the most seasoned investigators.
I can't even imagine the sheer number of bodies, the methodical way they were concealed. It paints a chilling picture of Corll's calculated cruelty.
And the boat shed wasn't the only site. Corll also used Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island Beach to dispose of victims. It speaks to the premeditation, the effort he took to cover his tracks and silence those young voices forever.
It's almost too much to process. We're talking about at least 28 lives lost, each one a world of potential, a family shattered. Before we go any further, I think it's important to shift our focus to those individual stories, to remember that these weren't just numbers, They were real people.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so easy to get lost in the scale of this case, the sheer number of victims, the horrifying details. But it's so important to remember each one of those 28 lives represents a son, a brother, a friend, a whole world extinguished.
Yeah, and in our research, we came across so many heart-wrenching accounts of families desperately searching for their missing boys. And one that really stood out to me was the story of James Glass and Danny Yates,
Right.
both just 14 years old,
14 years old.
lured away from a religious rally by Brooks.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, their families went through absolute hell. Putting up missing posters, hired private investigators, did everything they could to find their boys, and tragically, like so many other families in this case, they were initially dismissed by the police.
It's just infuriating.
The runaway label slapped on so many of these missing boys, almost as if their disappearances weren't deemed worthy of serious investigation.
Yeah, it speaks to a societal bias that was sadly prevalent at the time. You know, there was this tendency to overlook missing teenagers, particularly boys from certain backgrounds. The idea that a serial killer could be methodically targeting young men in their community was almost unthinkable.
It makes you wonder how many lives might have been saved if those early reports had been taken more seriously, if the police had connected the dots sooner.
It's a haunting question that underscores the importance of thorough and unbiased investigations, of treating every missing persons case with the urgency it deserves, regardless of the individual's background or social standing.
Another case that really stuck with me was that of the Waldrop brothers, Donald and Jerry.
Oh my gosh.
They were on their way to a bowling alley.
Just kids.
When Brooks lured them into Corll's van, their father actually saw Corll burying something at the boat shed, but the police dismissed his concerns.
You know, it's a tragic illustration of how assumptions and a lack of proper investigation can have such devastating consequences. The Waldrop brothers, like so many others, were denied justice simply because their disappearances didn't fit the narrative the authorities were willing to accept.
And then there was David Hilligiest and Gregory Winkle, also teenagers who vanished on their way to a swimming pool. Winkle actually managed to call his mother from Corll's apartment, but the call was cut short. Can you imagine the terror those boys must have felt?
It's a chilling detail. That brief phone call, a fleeting moment of hope, abruptly cut off. It really underscores the helplessness of these victims, their desperate attempts to reach out for help silenced before they could be fully heard.
It wasn't just the victims who suffered, though, right? Their families were left to deal with the unimaginable grief, the agonizing uncertainty, and the anger of knowing that their loved ones had been failed by the system that was supposed to protect them.
Absolutely. The ripple effect of Corll's crimes is immeasurable. We're talking about decades of pain, the psychological scars that linger long after the headlines fade away. It's a stark reminder that the impact of violence extends far beyond the immediate victims.
We've touched on the grim reality of those boat shed discoveries, but can you talk a little more about the forensic evidence that was uncovered? I mean, what did those findings tell us about Corll and his crimes?
Well, apart from the sheer number of bodies, there were some truly disturbing discoveries made at the boat shed, including what investigators called a torture board. It was this plywood structure with handcuffs, ropes, and other devices clearly intended for inflicting pain.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It sends chills down my spine just thinking about what those poor victims endured.
It provides some insight into the sadistic nature of Corll's crimes. This wasn't just about killing, it was about exerting absolute control, about deriving pleasure from the suffering of others. It's a deeply disturbing aspect of the case.
So we've got Corll, this deeply disturbed individual, and these two teenage accomplices who are also victims of his abuse. It's such a twisted dynamic. Can we delve a bit more into the roles Brooks and Henley played in all of this?
Their stories are a complex mix of victimhood and culpability. Both were young and impressionable when they met Corll. They were drawn into his web of manipulation and abuse. On one hand, they were victims themselves. On the other hand, they actively participated in luring other victims in the torture and ultimately in the deaths of those young men.
And you mentioned earlier that Henley ultimately killed Corll. What led to that confrontation?
Well, it was a chaotic and violent night. By Henley's account, Corll was in a rage, threatening to kill him. And two other teenagers who were at the house, Henley claimed he acted in self-defense, shooting Corll to protect himself and the others.
So he essentially became the one to end Corll's reign of terror, albeit in a very violent and messy way. It's a strange twist of fate, the victim turning on his abuser.
Yeah, it's a morally ambiguous situation, one that raises all these questions about survival, about the limits of free will when you're under the influence of a manipulative and dangerous individual. Henley's actions that night undeniably saved lives, but they also came at a tremendous cost.
So I'm guessing this wasn't an open and shut case, right? What happened to Brooks and Henley after Corll's death?
Both faced trials for their roles in the murders. The outcomes, however, really highlight the complexities of assigning blame and seeking justice in a case as horrific as this one.
You mean they didn't both receive the same sentence?
No. Henley, who confessed to shooting Corll, claimed self-defense and led police to the bodies, received 6 consecutive life sentences. Brooks, who cooperated with the prosecution but was deemed less directly responsible for the murders, received a single life sentence.
So Henley, the one who ultimately ended Corll's spree, ended up with a harsher sentence than Brooks, even though Brooks was involved for a longer period of time.
Yeah, it's a point of contention.
Yeah.
The differing sentences really sparked debate, with some arguing that Henley, despite his role in stopping Corll, should receive a punishment equal to or even exceeding Brooks's. It really highlights the challenges of achieving true justice, a sense of closure in a case with so much suffering and such a tangled web of culpability.
It's a lot to unpack. We've covered so much ground already. Corll's seemingly normal life, masking his monstrous crimes, the roles of his accomplices, the devastating impact on the victims and their families. But this case doesn't end neatly, does it? Even with Corll's death and the convictions of his accomplices, there are still unanswered questions. You're right about that. It's a case that stays with you even after you think you've grasped the full extent of the horror. Those unanswered questions, the lingering mysteries, they really add another layer of tragedy.
Yeah, I think one of the most unsettling aspects for me is that some of Corll's victims remain unidentified even to this day. It's as if their stories are frozen in time, their identities lost in the shadows of his crimes.
It's heartbreaking. Can you tell us more about those cases? Were they all found in the bow shed?
Most were, but the passage of time, the limitations of forensic technology back then, and just the sheer number of victims have made identification incredibly difficult. One case that particularly stands out is that of John Doe, 1973.
What do we know about him?
His remains were among those discovered in the boat shed. We know he was a young man, likely in his late teens or early 20s. He was found wearing a khaki shirt with a peace symbol, cowboy boots, and a letter ankle bracelet. But despite those details, no one has come forward to claim him.
It's haunting to think of this young man, his life cut short, his name lost to history. And you mentioned the possibility of even more victims out there.
Yes, it's a chilling thought, but there's evidence to suggest that Corll might have started his killing spree even earlier than initially believed. Former co-workers at the candy factory recalled him digging holes years before the known murders. He claimed he was burying spoiled candy, but given what we know now, those claims seem dubious at best.
So there could be more bodies buried somewhere, potentially dating back even further than the known victims. It's a horrifying thought, this idea that the full extent of his crimes might still be hidden.
Yeah, that's the unsettling nature of cases like this. Even with Corll's death and the convictions of Brooks and Henley, a sense of complete closure remains elusive. The possibility of more victims, more families left in the dark. It adds another layer of tragedy to an already horrific story.
Even though all of this happened back in the early 1970s, this case continues to resonate, doesn't it? It feels like it had a profound impact on how we view serial killers and police investigations.
Absolutely. The Houston mass murders, along with a few other high-profile cases of the era, really brought the concept of the serial killer into the public consciousness. It was a chilling wake-up call, forcing society to acknowledge that these monsters could exist in any community, often hiding in plain sight.
Before this case, did law enforcement even have the tools or the understanding to deal with this type of predator?
Not really. The term serial killer itself was relatively new. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which would later pioneer profiling techniques for serial criminals, was still in its infancy. The Corll case, with its staggering number of victims, the methodical nature of the crimes, and the fact that it went undetected for years, really forced a change in thinking.
So you're saying that the sheer scale of Corll's crimes, the fact that so many families had reported their sons missing only to be dismissed, exposed a critical flaw in police procedures.
Precisely. The runaway assumption, the tendency to not fully investigate missing persons cases involving young men, especially those from marginalized communities, was brought into sharp focus. It was a painful but necessary lesson.
A lesson learned at a terrible cost. What kind of changes did this case bring about in law enforcement?
Well, it led to a shift toward more proactive investigations, a greater emphasis on connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated cases and recognizing patterns that might indicate a serial predator at work. The Corll case also fueled the development of specialized units and task forces focused on missing persons and serial crimes.
It's tragic that it took such a horrific case to bring about these changes. But in a way, the legacy of those victims, the families who fought tirelessly for answers, helped pave the way for a more sophisticated and hopefully more effective approach to investigating these types of crimes.
Yeah, it's a testament to the enduring power of those who refuse to be silenced, who demand justice, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Their fight for answers helps reshape investigative protocols, ensuring that future cases would be handled with greater care and attention.
So we've explored the life of Dean Corll, the horrific details of his crimes, the devastating impact on his victims and their families. We've also examined the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long, and the lasting changes that this case brought about in law enforcement and in society as a whole.
It's a dark chapter in human history, one that forces us to confront the depths of depravity that humans are capable of. But it also highlights the importance of vigilance, the need to challenge assumptions, and the power of perseverance in the face of injustice.
And there's one question that I keep coming back to, and I imagine our listeners are wrestling with it too. Why? Why did Corll do it? What could possibly drive a person to commit such horrific acts?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And sadly, there's no easy answer. Psychologists and criminologists have offered various theories pointing to potential factors like repressed homosexuality, societal pressures, a need for control, even sadism. But none of these fully explain the sheer brutality and scale of his crimes.
It's unsettling to think that some acts of evil might just defy explanation. We can try to understand, to analyze, to categorize, but ultimately some aspects of human darkness remain unfathomable.
I think that's an important point. We shouldn't shy away from exploring the complexities of this case, but we also have to acknowledge that there are limits to our understanding.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive into those complexities today. This case really challenges our understanding of human nature, of the potential for evil to lurk beneath a seemingly ordinary facade.
But amidst the darkness, there are glimmers of hope. The resilience of the families, the dedication of the investigators, and the lasting changes that have been made to prevent future tragedies. Those are all testaments to the human spirit's ability to fight back, to seek justice, and to strive for a better world.
This deep dive has been a heavy one, a journey into a truly dark chapter of American history. But I think it's a story worth telling, a conversation worth having.
I agree. By confronting these difficult truths, by learning from the past, perhaps we can work towards a future where such horrors are less likely to occur.
If any of our listeners are interested in learning more about this case or about the ongoing efforts to identify the remaining victims, I encourage you to visit the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website. They have a wealth of information, and they continue to work tirelessly to bring closure to families who have lost loved ones.
And remember, each one of those victims was a real person with a life, a family, and a future stolen far too soon. Their stories deserve to be heard, their memories honored. And by keeping those stories alive, by demanding justice, by supporting organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we can help ensure that such horrors are never forgotten and hopefully never repeated.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an intense one, but I think it's a conversation we need to keep having. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, but most importantly, stay safe.